Welcome back. Well, guys, have you noticed that I'm in a new location? My room is gone, and we in the mountains with some palm trees, or whatever those are supposed to be. I thought I would hide my icky room that is under construction and have a little more pleasant background going on with my chroma cam. You can see the logo. That's what happens when you get free downloadable software. They keep the logo in the screen. So sorry about that. But I think it's a much better looking background than my messy room that is under all sorts of forms of construction. So I hope you watched those 3 videos that I asked you to take a look at involving sex addiction, so you have a really good sense of what the controversy is and why this is a controversy in the first place. So, boy, this gives weird effects. It's like weird, it's like supposed to be like a green screen, but I feel like a weird robot out of time. Ooh. Anyway, back to our class. So, why don't you meet me on slide number 4? Slide number 4. And if you're not already there, let's talk about sex addiction. So, the idea behind sex addiction is that there is a persistent, excessive sexual behavioral pattern, right? That is above and beyond normal variation in human sexual desire, human sexual urges, human sexual activity. Now, of course, we have to ask ourselves, when we're talking about something that is a part of natural human functioning, in fact, something that we need to survive, food, water, sleep, sex, these are all part of our normal human urges and our human needs. And so that in and of itself makes sex addiction, that's a new word, sex addiction, makes sex addiction a controversial topic. As I mentioned with regard to food, same idea here. Can something that is part of normal human functioning, and many would argue a necessity for human functioning, like food and sex, can we call that an addictive process, or is it something that just naturally varies from very low levels to very high levels to everything in between? So what do we mean by persistent and, more importantly, excessive when we're talking about sexual behavior? Technically, I want to mention to you that sex addiction is not currently a diagnosable disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. It was under consideration for becoming an official disorder in DSM-5, but it was ultimately rejected as a bona fide diagnosable disorder. Having said that, as you can see from the videos I asked you to watch, it's being treated in clinical circles. There are a variety of different clinics around the country and around the world that are devoted to treating, quote, sex addiction. There are medical and psychiatric professionals who are claiming this is an actual disorder, who are treating this disorder, who are labeling it as if it is a disorder. So hypersexual disorder, as it was called, hyper meaning excessive sexual disorder, was considered for addition to the DSM-5. It was ultimately rejected. However, as I just said, as you can see from the videos, there are clinicians all around the country and the world who are treating it as if it is in fact a disorder. Now, this is not exactly a new concept. In the 1800s, as a matter of fact, as early as 1812, quote, hypersexuality as a clinical problem was discussed in the medical literature. Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush was a medical doctor. He also happened to be a founding father who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was born in the late 1700s. And he was known as kind of a civic leader in Philadelphia. In addition to being a medical professional, he was a politician, he was a social reformer, he was an educator. I mean, he had a lot of different roles in his lifetime. But he is also often referred to as an important founding member of modern medicine. And Benjamin Rush actually recounted in the 1800s a case of a man whose, quote, excessive sexual appetite caused him psychological distress. So remember, psychological distress is subjective. The individual feels tortured by the experience. He spoke of a man who had excessive sexual appetite to the point of psychological distress, So much so that he requested he be medically rendered impotent. So, in effect, he wanted to take medication or have a procedure that would make it impossible for him to get an erection to curb what he felt was an excessive drive for sex, interfering with his life and causing him a lot of distress. In the 1880s, 1886, German psychiatrist Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who was well known in the sexual deviance literature, argued that pathological sexuality is a bona fide psychiatric illness, regardless of the fact that sexuality is a part of human functioning. He argued that there is a form of deviant sexual need, sexual desire, sexual behavior that is in fact a clinical problem. Now, nearly a century later, so we're talking almost 100 years later, a British psychologist by the name of Dr. Jim Orford argued that hypersexuality should in fact be included in the spectrum of addictive disorders. So this is 1970s. He argued that there is a place in the addictive diagnostic literature to include excessive, what he believed to be addictive sexual behavior. Now, it's interesting that many would argue overdiagnosis appears to be a problem because it's not really even a diagnosis in the current DSM. But as I think I've convinced you by now, many medical professionals, many psychiatric professionals treat it like it is anyway, and it's seemingly being diagnosed with high levels of frequency. In 2010, researcher by the name of Levine analyzed the sexual patterns of 30 men who had been referred for problems to clinicians with so-called sexual addiction disorder. And he found that only 25%, so we're talking a fourth, of his case studies actually met the criteria for what would be considered in the clinical world a, quote, addictive pattern. And by the way, even what that means is debatable. What does it mean to have an addictive pattern of sexual behavior? How much is too much? Does that even make sense when we're talking about a natural behavior like sex that varies across people and is part of human functioning? So I want you to think about that for a moment. What does that mean? Do you think it makes sense to treat sexual behavior as if it can become excessive or addictive? Think about that and then meet me on slide number 5 to talk about what the proposed criteria for sexual addiction was when it was being considered for DSM-5.